Hi, my name is Lauren Gleason. I'm a registered dietitian and board certified specialist in renal nutrition. And today I want to talk to you about potassium food labeling because it is not at all as straightforward as we would hope it would be. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background. So for a really long time, you couldn't find potassium listed on the nutrition facts label, which was definitely a sore spot for people with kidney disease who were trying to be mindful of their potassium. In 2016, though, the FDA updated its nutrition facts label requirements and mandated that potassium be included on the food label. So hooray, dietitians, people with kidney problems, everybody was doing a happy dance at this point. Definitely took a few years for every food manufacturer to comply with these rules, but by now, every manufacturer that's covered by this ruling should be complying. But there are still some issues because not every food has potassium listed still. And some foods say zero potassium, even when they definitely have some potassium in them. So let's explore this a little bit more. Let's start by addressing why potassium might not be listed on a food label. As it turns out, there are different regulations for food labeling depending on what type of food something is. Foods that fall under the jurisdiction of the FDA, which includes things like beverages, cereals, snacks, dairy products, some other processed foods, these foods are supposed to have potassium listed on the label, and they usually do. On the other hand, some foods follow the USDA food labeling regulations, which do not require potassium labeling. The USDA regulates labeling for meat, poultry, and egg products. These manufacturers may include potassium voluntarily, but they're not required to. And I frequently see foods that don't have the labeling on there. Let me show you an example of these ham cubes. So ham cubes would fall under the USDA because it's meat, so they're not really required to list out the potassium. And if you take a look at their food label, which I've kind of blown up here, they don't list out potassium. And you might be tempted to assume that a food that doesn't have potassium listed doesn't have potassium. But here's the kicker. Not only is there potassium that naturally occurs in meat products, so this definitely has some potassium in it because all meat products have potassium in it, but this food even has potassium added to it, and it's still not on the nutrition facts label, which is super frustrating. So I actually, for this particular example, I was able to find an old entry in the USDA food database where they did at one point report the potassium content of these ham cubes. And according to that, each 2-ounce serving, 2 ounces, that is not a lot of food, 2 ounces has 460 milligrams of potassium, which is roughly the same amount that's in a large banana. So these are definitely not a low potassium food, even though they don't list out the potassium content in their nutrition facts label. So the moral of this little story is that don't assume that a food with no nutrition facts for potassium has zero potassium. It just means that the manufacturer wasn't required to put it on a label. Next weird quirk with food labeling is that sometimes potassium is listed on the nutrition facts label, but it says zero, even though there's definitely some potassium in the food. So as an example, I've got this label here for Thousand Island salad dressing. I've highlighted where it says 0% potassium, and then I've also taken the liberty of highlighting the 2 potassium additives in the food. So seems a little off, to have potassium in the ingredients and yet say that there's 0 potassium in the food. And the reason for this is based on the rules that the FDA set up for potassium. So when the FDA set up the regulation, they said that anything that contains less than 2% of the daily value for potassium can just say 0, because I guess they just, considered that such an insignificant amount that it didn't matter. And maybe 2% doesn't sound like much, but it helps to understand what the daily value is. So the daily value, it's a reference amount set by the FDA to help people understand how much of a particular nutrient is in a single serving of food when you compare it to the total daily needs. So for potassium, the FDA's daily value is 4,700 milligrams per day, which represents the amount that they consider adequate for most healthy individuals. And if you are watching this and you have CKD, you probably just gasped a little bit at the thought of 4,700 milligrams of potassium. However, the regulations even admit that they did not consider the needs of those individuals with kidney disease when they were choosing this amount. So this amount is not necessarily something that someone with CKD would aim for, but the labeling can still be useful to help determine how much potassium is in a serving of a particular food. So here's a chart on the screen where I've converted the common percent daily values you might see and what those would roughly equate to. So if you see a food label that just lists out the percent daily value of potassium, doesn't have a number, this is roughly what that percent is going to equate to. But let's focus on that 2% there at the top. 2% of 4,700 is 94 milligrams. So the FDA essentially considers anything under 94 milligrams to be insignificant. So foods that contain less than 94 milligrams of potassium can legally say that they have 0 milligrams, or they can say not a significant source of potassium. And I think we can all agree that maybe we have different ideas of what significant means when it comes to potassium. So going back to this little example with the salad dressing, the label says 0% potassium, but it could have up to 93 milligrams of potassium. So that would be, just under that 94 milligram threshold. So if you're reading a food label and you see 0%, just know that it could have some potassium in it. And right about now, you're probably just throwing your hands up in the air in exasperation. But let me share some good news. If you've got CKD and you're not on dialysis, there's a really good chance that you don't actually need to be watching your potassium intake that much. And not only that, but there are a lot of things that can impact your potassium level that have nothing to do with the potassium in your food. And if you're curious as to what some of those things are, I do have a free mini course right now that you can sign up for. You should see a pop-up somewhere on the screen for it, and I'll include a link to it in the description of this video. But there are simple things that you could be doing that might be throwing off your potassium, or there are things that you could do to prevent a high potassium in the first place that are much more effective than worrying about every little milligram of potassium in food. So really. But to summarize this video, potassium is only required on some food labels. Don't assume a food has 0 potassium if it isn't listed. And then if a food label says 0 or not a significant source, just know it can still have some potassium in it. And if you found this video helpful, I'd love it if you could hit the thumbs up symbol to show your support. I also love to read comments. I might not be able to reply to them all, but I do read them and I use them to help figure out what sort of videos you might like to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe to the Kidney Foodie channel as well, and don't forget to sign up for that free mini course if you want to learn more about managing potassium levels with less food restrictions.